Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak with a new video on how to add color to your skin boat. We just finished a color test that has literally been 2 years in the making, and before I share that with you, I just want to mention a couple things. So first up, this is going to be a dual purpose video for my YouTube channel and also my skin on frame boat building courses. So if you're watching this in the skin on frame boat building course and it seems like a YouTube video, that's why. So, backing up a bit, I've been a full-time skin-on-frame boat builder for over 20 years, and for the majority of that time, I colored the boats with acid dye painted directly onto the nylon fabric, and then after that, we painted it with 2-part polyurethane to waterproof the cloth. Now, the good thing about acid dye is that as long as you apply it correctly, you can get really vibrant, smooth colors. But the bad thing is that because the dye is painted underneath the coating, as the coating ages, it has a pretty dramatic effect on the appearance of the boat, which isn't that bad in the warmer, brighter tones, but can look pretty brutal on the darker colors after just a couple years of UV exposure. Acid dye also doesn't work on polyester or very tightly woven nylons. And finally, because acid dye has a tendency to micro powder on the surface of the fabric, you have to be really careful with the amount that you put in, otherwise you can run into issues with adhesion of the coating. Now, the other option for coloring a skin boat is to mix earth pigment directly into the 2-part polyurethane, which avoids a lot of the problems with acid dye, but I never really took that option seriously until a couple years ago because the urethane application methods we used to use didn't result in a perfectly even coating thickness, and when the color is suspended in the coating and the coating isn't even, the net result is a streaky, blotchy boat, which might be fine for some people, but is definitely not good enough for my standards. Now, if we fast forward to about 5 years ago when we made a pretty big change in how we applied the 2-part polyurethane, suddenly we were able to get a much more even coating thickness, which reopened the possibility for using earth pigments. So I started experimenting with mixed results at first and then better results later. The problem was that not all earth pigments would apply evenly and the colors were fairly unpredictable. But I felt like with enough experimentation, I should be able to solve those problems. So I spent the last 3 years doing a huge amount of testing to figure out which pigments will actually work and making samples with documented quantities for reproducible results. And as of literally 3 days ago, we just finished the final step in that process, which was taking our sample palette and then exposing it to 1,000 hours of sunlight with half of each sample covered, so you can see the difference between how the colors start out versus how they end up over time. So obviously we made a lot more color samples than this, but I'm pretty sure you guys don't want to sit here and listen to me talk about every individual color for over an hour. So instead what I did is I just picked out some earth pigment samples that are representative of the main color groups, and I picked out some corresponding acid dye samples so you can compare the difference between these two products. And once again, the way that we made these samples is after we applied the different products initially, we covered 1/2 of each sample piece and then we exposed them to sunlight over the course of a summer, so they got about 1,000 hours of direct sunlight. And this is a great opportunity to see how the acid dye ages compared to the earth pigment, because there's some pretty big differences here. So just to give us a baseline reference, this is what the nylon cloth looks like uncoated. And this is what it looks like with the polyurethane freshly painted on top of it with no dye and no pigment. Now, on this side, you can see that same polyurethane after 1,000 hours of exposure to sunlight, and you can see right away that there's a pretty dramatic color change. Now, there are polyurethanes that don't change color this much, but unfortunately, they are extremely expensive and also extremely toxic. So for me, it's always made more sense just to work around this issue as opposed to using one of those other products, which is one of the big reasons that when I was using acid dye, I was always using more of the warmer earth tones because those tend to be more compatible with this color change than some of the cooler and brighter colors. So moving on to some of the warmer colors, just for reference for the rest of this video, I'm going to put the earth pigments up top and these smaller samples down below are the acid dye, and I'm going to put the side that is freshly coated on this side of the screen and the side that was exposed to sunlight on this side of the screen. So Anyways, starting out over here with this yellow color, I know this probably looks a little bit more orange, but this camera does a terrible job of rendering color. Both this earth pigment and this acid dye look very yellow on a coated boat. And you can see that after the sunlight exposure, they're both darkening about the same amount. And so for these very warmest colors, you could use earth pigment or acid dye and get pretty much the same color results. But the difference is that if we were to expose this acid dye sample to another 1,000 hours of sunlight, I can tell you from experience that this is going to start to look worse and worse. It's going to start to look chalky and it's going to start to crack a little bit. And none of that reduces the lifespan of the skin or does anything to the durability. It just doesn't look as good after a few years as an earth pigment colored boat. Now over here you could see these more orange looking samples, and these are not exactly the same color, but they're sort of in the same family and they're doing the same thing as well. They're a little bit lighter to start out and they get a little bit darker and they get a little bit richer. Now, moving into these darker oranges and sort of sienna tones on this side, you start to see the big difference between how acid dye weathers and earth pigment weathers. So for instance, up here on this sample, this starts out a lot lighter and then over time it starts to get darker and richer. Whereas acid dye is exactly the opposite. It starts out really beautiful. We've got this nice rich sunset color over here, but then it starts to get lighter and it starts to fade. And I can tell you from personal experience that if this was actually out there being used for a couple years, it would start to look a lot worse than this, and you might even start to see some cracking. And then over here, we've got one of my favorite colors in earth pigment. This is burnt sienna. It's just a beautiful kind of red, orange, brown color. And then you can see on this side, once again, it gets darker and it gets richer. And it's worth keeping that in mind because if you want to end up with a lighter color like this, you need to mix less pigment into the solution. So ultimately it ends up a little bit lighter over on this side. And then down here, this is one of the only acid dye panels that wasn't exposed to sunlight. So this is all just a freshly coated piece. And you can see that in the beginning, it's absolutely beautiful. That's a great color. But I can tell you that if we had half of this colored, it would actually look worse than this one over here because it's a darker color. Next up, moving into some of the red colors. In this case, the acid dye samples that I have aren't a very good match for the earth pigment samples because quite honestly, I almost never used straight red dye on a skin boat because red dyes are notoriously not color fast. And if you try to dye a skin boat red, it's always going to turn pink or orange. And so this is the straight russet color, which I never used by itself, but I did mix with other pigments. And you can see it starts out kind of nice, but pretty quickly it's starting to turn brown, it's starting to turn orange, and that problem's only going to get worse over time. And so for me personally, the only amount of red that I was willing to put on a skin boat with the acid dye would be to mix it. So for example, here I've got 2 teaspoons of red and 2 teaspoons of brown. And this starts out kind of a reddish brown, but once again, over time, it's starting to just sort of turn generally brown. Now, coming up here to the earth pigments, this is not actually a very good example of what these would look like on your boat because for whatever reason, the red earth pigment is a much more dense color, but I standardized all of my tests to the same amount of scoops of pigment so I know how to reproduce the colors. So in the case of red pigments only, I would recommend not going full strength like you can see on these samples right here, but putting a little bit less in if you want these to be a little bit warmer and a little bit more translucent, like you can see with some of the other color samples. And I've got specific instructions for that both on the website and also in the plans. But the exciting things about these earth pigment reds is that they are completely color fast, which means that you can start with a red boat and after a couple years, you're still gonna have a red boat at whatever color density you initially select. So that's exciting because over the years, a lot of people have wanted red boats and now we have a way to give that to you. All right, so moving into more of the brown spectrum, something I want to mention really quick is that if you see any splotchiness on any of these earth pigment samples, that doesn't have to do with the dye, that just has to do with the application process. It's a lot harder to make consistent earth pigment samples than it is acid dye samples. So anyways, here is where you can really start to see where the acid dye starts to fall apart. So for example, starting with the lighter colors all the way through the darker and kind of cooler colors over here, I would say that, at least to my eye, these colors are almost completely stable both before and after the UV exposure. They do warm up a little bit, but it's not very noticeable. But when you look at the acid dye samples down here, I mean, look at the distinction in this colors change. You can see this one over here, it's kind of a little bit redder and a little bit more brown, turns light brown. This one right here also has kind of a little bit of burgundy brown. This one turns even worse brown. And then this one over here is probably the most color stable of all of these, but you can see we've still got a color change going on. And with the brown colors, especially over time, these start to wear really bad. Like on an actual skin boat, you will see these not only turn lighter, but they start to mottle in a really weird way, and they get kind of chalky on the surface, which doesn't look very good, which is something that never happens with the earth pigments. And so for the brown colors, huge fan of the earth pigments, and my favorite one personally is this burnt umber right here. I like it because it's still a nice rich brown, but it's also a little bit lighter, it's a little bit more translucent, and I always like to be able to see through a skin boat so I can see that it's a skin boat. All right, so moving on to some of the cooler colors. On this side, we've got some greens. Down here in the acid dye, I actually start out with kind of a spruce color because I know that that's gonna weather towards more of a green over time as that blue starts to disappear. And then with the earth pigment up here, if you want green, you can just start with green and end up with green that's just slightly darker. And just like with the red colors I talked about earlier, this particular green is really, really intense, which means that it might be worth putting a little bit less pigment into your batch if you don't want it to be quite as opaque as what you're looking at right here. Just keep in mind that anytime you're reducing the overall amount of earth pigment that you're putting in your 2-part polyurethane, you're going to see more of the yellowing effect of the coating coming through, like you can see with this yellowing of the coating that's actually on top of the acid dye. Now, coming over here to the blues, when I did my acid dye test, I didn't have any blue dye, so I just went ahead and put some purple on the fabric, just so I can show people the very sad thing that happens with any blue or purple dye with acid dye. So take a look at this right here. If you like this color, this looks great going on, but this is what this looks like after 1,000 hours. And given that reality, I would say that acid dyes are completely off the table for anything in the blue to purple range. However, if we come up here to the earth pigment, you can see we've got this really vibrant blue here on this side. And this is one of the places where you actually do see the yellowing from the coating starting to really affect an earth pigment color. And so we've got blue here, but we've got more of kind of a, I don't know if you'd call this a teal or a marine color over here. And personally, I think both of these colors are great. I don't know if there's any way you could actually get a blue that's going to be able to stay blue with earth pigment or acid dye, but at least in the case of the earth pigment, you end up with a color that's still pretty nice, even though it's not the color that you originally started out with. And they do make different blue earth pigments, and we'll probably be experimenting with different ones over the next couple years. And if I find something that's even better than this one, I will definitely put it on the site as a possibility. All right, so final color I want to talk about here is black. And black is brand new for me because even though they do make a black acid dye, I found out the hard way that it has a chemistry compatibility problem with the 2-part polyurethane. And if you try to acid dye a skin boat black and then to put the 2-part polyurethane over it, the polyurethane actually starts to foam and then the whole thing peels off the surface like a snakeskin. So black was never something we could achieve in the past, but it looks like, at least with these preliminary tests, that black tends to be fairly color fast in the earth pigments. And you can see that it does get a little bit yellower on this side. So for me personally, I don't want a jet black boat. So if I'm looking to go really dark like this, I usually mix black and brown together. That way, if over the long term it starts to yellow out, it looks a little bit more deliberate, like a dark chocolate color, as opposed to just a black color that's turned a little bit yellow. But if you look at this side, this is 1,000 hours of exposure to some pretty intense sunlight, and it's still looking pretty good. So if you want a black boat, you can definitely have one. Just keep in mind that any black skin boat is going to be very, very hot if you're living somewhere with intense sunlight. So if you're paddling in British Columbia or in the Pacific Northwest and you're not going out on a lot of hot, bright, sunny days, I think a darker boat like this would be fine. But if you're living in the Florida Panhandle or wherever in the southern United States and you're paddling a lot in the sun, there's a chance that you're gonna melt yourself alive inside of a black boat. So just keep that in mind. So once again, I just want to remind you that you can see all the color samples that I just showed you on the color page on our website. And that same information is also in the store where you can buy these pigments along with the recipes of how much to use for different colors. Also, this experiment is going to be an ongoing process, so you can expect to see new color options in the future as well. So, I think the obvious takeaway from all this is that I'm leaning pretty much exclusively towards earth pigments these days. We still carry acid dye in the store, and I've left the instructions for how to acid dye your boat in the video courses. But for me personally, the advantages of earth pigment just vastly outweigh the disadvantages, especially now that we have predictable, reproducible color recipes. Now, the only caveat here is that with earth pigments, good color results absolutely depend on good application techniques of the two-part polyurethane. And in my opinion, the manufacturer's application instructions just aren't good enough to guarantee a good result. So there's not really much I can do about that outside of my video courses, but if you do decide to take one of our skin-on-frame boat building courses, we have meticulous step-by-step instructions for every part of the process, and as long as you follow those instructions, I think it's very likely that you're going to end up with a good color result. All right, so I think that's it for now. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. You can find us on our website at capefalconkayaks.com, where we have skin-on-frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on-frame resources. Also, you can find us on Instagram at Cape Falcon Builds, where we post a daily build blog of everything we're working on here in the shop. And just like I say every time, even if you're not normally a social media person, I would really encourage you to check out the Instagram because there's just so much more cool stuff there than ever makes it onto the YouTube channel. As always, take care, be safe on the water, and have fun building your skin boat.